around and were seen by the Highway Patrol, by the National Guard. This was typical of what was going on all over the United States. What happened in 1967?
Yeah. Now, Gary Stearman, of course, comes from a flying family. His father's brother, I believe it was,
That's right,
built the Stearman Aircraft Company, which later became Boeing Aircraft, and then he went to Lockheed and became the president of Lockheed for a while.
That's correct.
It was in 1967 that Gary saw a UFO just outside his own airplane. Gary's a pilot. He flies. Doesn't want to talk about it much. We're not going to spend a great deal of time today. Maybe one of these days we'll flesh out this whole story. But Gary knows UFOs exist, for you saw one yourself.
As a matter of fact, on company time, I was flying an company aircraft for Cessna and delivering conference materials, flying between Dallas and Lubbock, Texas. And one of these flew right up beside me. It was a disc-shaped silver disc, flew right alongside my airplane, and I saw it at very close range, about 100 feet away. And of course, seeing is believing. You don't see this and forget about it. This sort of changes the way you look at it.
In case you wondered why Gary has written so many articles on UFOs in our magazines over the years, we now finally get him to admit publicly that he has seen his very own UFO. And so, enough of that for now. Let's get back to the 1973, the Yom Kippur War. This was the time for the next big flap of UFOs, wasn't it?
That's right. And in that year, Dr. Hynek, J.R. mentioned a minute ago, published a book called The UFO Experience, in which he said, quote, UFOs are now a respectable subject for scientific study. He was a famous astronomer. He was no kook. And he believed that there was documentary evidence. And at that time, he formulated what he called the close encounter hypothesis. Close encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind, and fourth kind. And a movie was made called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if you recall.
Yes.
In which occupants of UFOs supposedly contacted human beings. Well, J.R., October of 1973, the year of all of this UFO activity. And by the way, this is the year when UFO abductions really began to happen en masse. That year, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack upon Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Israeli calendar. And they thought, since the Jews are all fasting, the Jews are at rest, we'll take them. We'll go in there and we'll wipe them out. At that moment, at that time in history, UFOs were seen all over the world. And in fact, they were seen this time as metallic discs that would actually come over a city. Thousands of people would see them. Sometimes they would land and take off again. All of this in 1973.
I remember the one that came out in the Russian newspaper about this one that actually landed in a town square, I think. And
that's right.
And then took off again. It's incredible stories.
And that was not just that was not the only story. It was typical of many, many, many similar encounters. Once again, the idea is the correlation with key moments in Israeli history suggests that God's holy angels are fighting against the devil and his angels. And when the fighting becomes very brisk, this is when these UFO flaps seem to occur. In Daniel chapter 7, we have a picture of the throne of God, and from his throne are issuing wheels as burning fire. They're going out to do his bidding, J.R. And the fiery wheels are what people see in the skies. I'm convinced we often see angels, and we don't know what we're looking at.
Now, several years ago, Gary mentioned the fact that most of the photographs that were taken of UFOs, especially in the early days, were kind of fuzzy, nondescript, lights in the sky.
Right.
But he suggested at that time that as we near the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and Israel faces its ultimate enemies that will lead us into the tribulation period, he suggested that these photographs of UFOs would become clearer.
Indeed.
Well, Gary, You can't get much clearer than this.
Oh,
you
you
can see
can't.
the writing on the bottom of the craft.
Absolutely. And now, JR, we've talked about 5 UFO flaps starting in 1897, 1947, 48, 1956, 1967, 1973. The one going on right now is the 6th great UFO flap, suggesting to me that something is happening in Israel that is of a critical nature, which is why this current flap is going on.
Well, you remember in Revelation chapter 12, the big battle in the heavens.
Oh, yes.
Where Michael and his angels fight against the dragon and his angels. And the devil and his angels are thrown out of heaven, Gary, and are thrown down to the earth. And John, seeing this, writes, woe to the people who live on the earth at that time. So something may happen in the tribulation period. Of course, I'm convinced we'll be gone. But something will happen so that the people on the earth will recognize these alien beings. I don't know whether they will recognize them as friend or foe, but there will be some kind of introduction. Perhaps the Antichrist will fly in on a UFO. Who knows? A UFO will land somewhere, and he'll step out.
I don't believe these aliens are from outer space. I think we're talking about what are traditionally called fallen angels and demons, or God's holy angels. There's a battle in the heavens. Back in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed, J.R., that was a key moment in the life of Israel. And Josephus relates that during that time, certain prodigious and incredible phenomena appeared over Jerusalem. He says, I'm going to read this in a condensed nature. He says, before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and in Jerusalem and surrounding cities. Now, that would, if we were seen today, it would be called a UFO flap.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
Folks, please understand that we're trying to be credible here. We're not trying to bring you a fairy tale or an old wives' tale, but we do not wish to be viewed as crazy. These things actually have happened in Bible days. They are happening in this century. And the UFO flaps that are going on now are just phenomenal. And it's got to be something biblical, prophetic going on.
One final thought, and that would be this. The Carrot Project mentioned earlier suggests that our government's in league with these aliens, if you will, to discern and derive technology for our own use. A deal has been made, let's say, with the devil, sort of like Mephistopheles and Dr. Faust.
Yeah.
If in fact this is true, JR, it may be a final step downward for our country, because going all the way back to Project Jehovah, coming up to Project Carrot, it looks as though our government is dealing with dark powers.
So Area 51 is not a fairy tale after all.
Apparently not.
Fascinating. If you don't know Jesus as your Savior, you need to trust Him right away, because time's running out for this old world. Jesus is coming soon. This is J.R.CHURCH and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.
Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current program on audio tape, or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on videotape. For either order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.